Yeah, hi, this is Harold. I'm just recording Thursday's lecture. It's actually election night, so I've got to stay up a little late. Going to caffeinate myself somewhat. So I'm going to record Thursday's lecture while we're waiting for the results to come in. So let's share our screen and let's get ready to go. Okay, there. Pardon me, you'll have to hear the dishwasher in the background, but such is life. Okay, so I thought I'd cover chapters 11 and 12. I've got pictures by both me and by Sunny. The really nice ones are by Sunny. But a lot to cover. The first in chapter 11, what is a firm's production function? And why is production typically subject to diminishing returns to inputs? What types of costs does a firm face? And how does a firm generate its marginal and average cost curves? Short-term versus long-run costs and returns to scale. So packed agenda for chapter 11. This is a beautiful picture by Sunny. It is not quite sure what this is, but it's fantastic. So first is, what is a firm? That's actually a really interesting question. And there's a famous article by Ronald Coase called "The Nature of the Firm." If you think about some of the networked enterprises that we work with, it's sometimes a little bit unclear what the boundary is of a firm. But it's an organization that produces goods or services for sale. And production is the process of turning inputs into outputs. And the production function is the relationship between the quantity of inputs that a firm uses and the quantity of outputs that it produces. And the production technology is kind of the set of approaches that make that production function happen. As I've said many times in class, technology is a lot more than sort of some scientific thing. It's a whole set of organizational practices and innovations that go into it. There's a fixed input. An input whose quantity is fixed for the period of time and can't be varied. There's a variable input, which is an input that you can change the quantity, turn the dial at any time. Now, over a really long period of time, you can move the fixed inputs too, but over the short period of time, you can just turn the dial on the variable inputs. Okay. So again, long run is the period in which all inputs can be varied. And the short run is at least one of the inputs is fixed. Then there's this idea of the total product curve, which is just how the quantity of output depends on the quantity of the variable inputs. In particular, if you pick any one input like labor and you keep everything else fixed, how does my output change if I add additional units of labor? And that'll turn out to be important. And it turns out that things like wages really depend on that. Okay. So here's a classic example where we have wheat. And as we hire more workers, we produce more wheat. Now, note the first worker, we go from 0 to 19 bushels. So the first worker is incredibly productive. The second worker you get 17 more out of that second worker. Not quite as productive as the first worker, but pretty close. And as we move along, you see that the total product starts to sort of bow in this concave way. That just adding the sixth worker, you just don't get the same going from 5 to 6 that you did going from 1 to 2. And it could be that workers get in each other's way, or it could just be that you have enough workers for the given amount of land that you have, that you just don't, adding more workers just doesn't make you super more productive. But if we added more land as we're adding more workers, then the marginal product of workers would go up. So usually the marginal product of one input goes up when you add more of other inputs. If workers are all getting in each other's way on the farm because there's only so much good land to go around, if you added more land, then each worker becomes more productive. So if you want to raise the wages of American workers, one of the things that really works really well is if you add more complementary inputs into their work situation so that each one is more productive. So, if you want high wages for auto workers, if there's lots of computerized gear and stuff on the factory floor, that makes those workers more productive. Although in some cases, of course, there may be a substitution between capital and labor. But in general, workers benefit when they're in a situation where there is a lot of sort of complementary resources that make them productive. Okay. And so here's just the point that I was just making. The marginal product of an input, that's important. That's the additional quantity of the output that you get if you just added one more unit of that input, but kept everything else the same. And if you did calculus, that's basically the same as the partial derivative of the output with respect to that input. But so the marginal product of labor is I keep everything the same in the factory, but just have one more worker and say, how many more widgets do I get because I brought in that one worker? Usually the marginal product of labor declines as you hire more and more workers, in most, at least once you're at a reasonable scale in production. Okay. Here's just a nice picture up in Millennium Park of some kids. There's a picture of my daughters that I took 20 plus years ago that looks very similar to this one. So I love putting this picture in. So here's a classic example where the marginal product of labor, it's always positive. You benefit from having another worker, but boy, it's going down as you hire more and more workers. And of course, since workers have a wage and they're expensive, you're not going to want to hire workers all the way down here. There's going to be some point in here where you say, yeah, getting more output out of that additional worker, but not enough to justify having to pay that worker to have them there. And that's why we compare the marginal product of the worker with the wage and also how much the good sells for that the worker is helping to produce. If I get 10 more cars out of an additional worker, that means a lot more to a worker's wage than if I get 10 more sticks of gum. So it's not so the price of the good that you're producing matters a lot, and that's going to be called the marginal revenue product. We'll get to that in a bit. Okay. So here's just a classic example. One worker makes 14 baskets, two workers makes 34, three make 45, and four make 50. So which worker yielded the highest marginal product of labor? Of course, it's the second worker, because we went from 14 to 34. So the marginal product is 20, and that's even more than we got out of the first worker. And so with more land as a fixed input, each worker can produce more. This shifts the total product curve up, and that's just an interesting fact about the way that labor and capital and land kind of interact. Okay. Another picture of Sonny took, just a gorgeous picture. Here's a homework problem that kind of illustrates that. This is Marty's frozen yogurt. So you can see that, here's the quantity of labor, quantity of frozen yogurt. There's a bunch of stuff that's not changing, in the frozen yogurt store. So the first worker marginal product is 110. The second worker, you get more, but you only get 90 more, and then 70, 30, 20, 10. Now, one of the things that we look at is how much more money is coming in the cash register because you had another worker. Let's say that frozen yogurt sells for $3. I just made that up. Well, then the first worker, you're getting $330 more in the cash register because they're there. The second worker, you're getting $270 more because they're there. The third, 210, and it works its way down. Okay. So, if the wage of a worker were $200, then you'd basically want to say, okay, I'm going to hire the first three workers, but the fourth worker, I'm not bringing enough money in to justify the pay of that worker. So you're always comparing the marginal revenue product to how much to the compensation of the worker and thinking about, is it worth it to hire another worker? And let me say that again. The employer compares the marginal revenue product of hiring another worker with how much the wage cost would be of hiring that worker. And you keep hiring more workers until the marginal revenue product dips below how much you'd have to pay that worker to have that last worker involved in your production. Okay. By the way, chapter mentions Malthus, which predicts as population grows, the economy's diminished ability to produce food would eventually be started running into a food problem. And economists, by the way, 40 years ago were more convinced that Malthus was wrong than I think some of us are today. But the basic idea, Malthus was basically saying we were going to outdo food production if we keep expanding as a population. Malthus really didn't take into account that technology was going to, and physical capital were going to increase. I must say that the carrying capacity of the earth, a lot of us, when we think about climate change and so on, Malthus wasn't entirely wrong about a lot of this stuff either. Another great picture by Sunny. I really love this picture. So improved production technology and greater capital stock can at least forestall what Malthus was talking about. Okay, so the marginal product of labor is defined as the increase in the quantity of output when you increase the quantity of that input by 1 unit. Now, interesting thing about labor is, what do we mean by a unit of labor? Is it an additional person years, an additional hours, an additional week? The answer is it can mean any of these things, but you got to be consistent about it. And by the way, you might also note that that you could talk about marginal products of other things besides labor. Suppose we had a little bit more land, what's the marginal productivity of that? And you can imagine the price of land would be connected to that in some fundamental way. But the main thing, we do have to be consistent, and there are different reasons why you might measure labor in different ways for different purposes. Okay. So fixed cost, it's a cost that does not depend on the quantity of an output produced. It's just the cost of a fixed input. So if you just look at the fixed cost, very easy to determine in homeworks and on tests. It's just, if you're producing 0, how much does something cost? What's the total cost at 0? That's all you need to know. And that's you got to build a factory, you got to have lots of stuff there. Even if you don't produce anything, you still got to pay for those things. Variable cost is how much it costs once you start it and you start increasing the production. What's varying as we vary the quantity of output. And that's the cost of the variable inputs that you need to produce the variable outputs. In the short run, the variable cost is what you can actually control. The fixed cost is kind of just there. Okay. You own a deli, which of the following is likely a fixed input? You got the dining room, the bread, the tomato base, and the employees. Well, what do you think? Yep, dining room. Because that's just, you come in the morning, it's there. You can't get rid of your dining room, at least in the short term. That's just a fixed cost. Okay. Now, the total cost of producing something is the fixed cost plus the variable cost. And the total, and now what's usually happening after a certain point anyway, is that the total cost curve starts to get steeper as more and more output is produced. And that's kind of the result of diminishing returns, or there's some kind of bottleneck in the production process that's starting to make the cost go up a lot as you try to produce your last unit. So I'm a farmer, I'm producing corn, and at some point as I'm trying to produce more and more corn, I'm basically having to go to the worst part of my field where the land is just less productive. And so it starts to become really expensive to produce another bushel of corn because I'm using the crappiest land. So generally we assume diminishing returns. There are some exceptions to that, but that's generally what we assume. Here's just a total cost curve. And this is sort of a nice little spreadsheet. One thing you might want to do is figure out the marginal cost here. It's pretty straightforward to do. You just figure out how much is the total cost going up as we increase our quantity produced. But you could see that that the total cost is starting to look steeper and steeper. And going from A to B, we went from 0 to 19. Well, going from 91 to 96, you can see it's just getting a lot steeper. Now, the marginal cost is the change in total cost that's generated by one additional unit of output. So the change in total cost divided by change in quantity. Obviously, if you took calculus, this is just the derivative of total cost with respect to the quantity. Not that that matters, but that's just what it is. It's the slope of that total cost curve as a function of quantity. Yeah. That's just a picture I took in Paris. Perhaps the first flower child in recorded history. I had some dude from the 19th century. I was in a cemetery in Paris. So here we have just Selena's gourmet salsa, and you can see that here's just how the marginal costs are calculated. And you just if you're struggling a little bit with marginal cost, just kind of go through and see how this is calculated. 300 minus 216 is 84. 408 minus 300 is 108, and so on. And note the fixed cost is always 0. The fixed cost is always 108. And the variable cost is going up. And if you take the variable cost plus the fixed cost, you get the total cost. And you can see the variable cost is starting to come up pretty fast. The way that this thing is done, there is a pretty steep, the curve is getting steeper over time as we're getting more and more output. So if we just, here's our total cost curve, and you can see that that the marginal costs are going up. In fact, in this case, the marginal costs are just going up in a linear way. And so this thing is kind of going up like a square term or a parabola. But you can see the 8th case of salsa, the marginal cost is $180 compared to the second case where it's only $36. So this particular case, the marginal cost is going up a lot. Okay. Because there's diminishing returns to inputs, marginal products of each of the input variables declines, and that means that you need to apply more and more of the inputs in order to get another unit of output. And that's what makes it so expensive, why that marginal cost is going up as you go along, because you need to just put in more and more expensive inputs to get one more unit of output. And that's kind of why the marginal costs are often increasing. Let me just say that again. Because you've got diminishing returns, you've got to apply more and more expensive inputs to get another unit of output when you already are producing a lot of output. And that bottleneck is what's really making that marginal cost curve go up. Okay. Another picture from Paris. I don't exactly know what this thing is, but it's kind of funky. I kind of like it. The average total cost is just the total cost divided by the quantity produced. Average fixed cost is the fixed cost divided by the quantity produced. You can see the average fixed cost by this kind of coming down, and the average variable cost is the variable cost over Q. So when you have really large quantities, this thing is usually pretty unimportant. If you have huge quantities, I built a factory and I'm producing 1 billion chips. If I'm producing 1 billion chips, the fixed cost of my factory is kind of becomes a small fraction of my total costs at that point. If I'm in a pretty low level of production, you can see the average fixed cost could be really quite important for me. Okay. So here's an example. You're producing 4 widgets at a total cost of $40. Then you produce one more widget, and it's got a marginal cost of $5. So now you've produced 5 widgets at a total cost of 40 plus 5 equals 45. So what's happening to my average total cost? Well, my total cost is now 40 plus 5 equals 45, produced 5 widgets. So my average total cost is now $9. Just because 9 times 5 equals 45. Yeah. Now my average total cost is coming down because notice when I produced 4 widgets for $40, my average cost per widget was 40 divided by 4, which is $10. But because the marginal cost of producing the 5th widget was only $5, it's pulling the average down. So it pulled it from 10 to 9. Here's just average cost for Selena's situation. You can see the average fixed cost is constantly dropping. Average variable cost is not dropping. It's coming up. Okay. And so the average total cost kind of has a little bit of a U shape to it. You know, it's got a minimum that's like here at 3, but then it starts to come up again. Okay. So this is a classic average total cost curve. Let me just see if I can get all there we go. Now this minimum point 3, this turns out to be really important in competitive markets, because if you have a super competitive market with lots and lots of price taking firms, each one is kind of, you're gonna have lots of them, and each one of them is going to be producing at that efficient point M. And the idea is that's the most efficient place that a firm can produce. It's minimum average total cost. So if we wanted to produce lots and lots of cases of salsa in the most efficient way in a competitive market, the equilibrium price is ultimately going to be, you know, whatever it is here. It's a little hard for me to see with my vision issues. It's a little bit less than 80. You have lots and lots of firms. Each one of these firms is producing 3 cases because that's just the cheapest way to do it. And you have lots of price-taking firms that are each doing that and producing at that level. And the industry supply curve is going to be completely flat at whatever the height is right here. So you know, just draw that across. That's what the industry supply curve is going to look like. Just a bird in Midwan that I took a picture of. I do like that picture. Just check on the recording. Okay. Now notice when you increase the output, you've got 2 opposing effects on the average total cost. One is the average fixed cost is always going down as you're producing more, because you're spreading out that average fixed cost over more units. So the average fixed cost is always dropping, but there's a diminishing returns effect that eventually starts to go up. So, you know, the average variable cost also kind of may look like a U, but eventually it's going to be pushing up. So marginal cost curves eventually slope upwards because of diminishing returns. Average variable costs also slope upwards, but it tends to be flatter than the marginal cost curve. The marginal cost curve basically starts to drag the average variable cost curve up. Hold on, I'm just going to get a soda. Of course, I've just proven that this thing was just a prop. So what can I do? So if the marginal cost curve is going up really fast, it's starting to drag up the average variable cost. The average fixed cost curve is always kind of dropping. And at some point, though, the average variable cost kind of coming up ends up being the more important thing. Now, here's the thing that's kind of profound. It's kind of a mathy thing, but it also turns out to be really important in the economics, which is that the marginal cost curve, when it's coming up, when it's below the average total cost curve, it basically crosses it from below, and it crosses that average total cost curve at the minimum of the average total cost. And so if we come back up here, the marginal cost curve is going to come up, and it's just going to hit that right there. It's going to come up through there. And that seems a little bit weird, but the intuition is actually pretty simple, which is if the marginal cost is below the average total cost, producing one more unit kind of drags the average cost down because the last unit we produce is pretty cheap. So the average cost is always declining when the marginal cost curve is below the average total cost curve. Now, if the marginal cost curve is above the average So if the marginal cost curve is above the average total cost curve, producing one more unit is going to drag the average up because the last unit costs more than the average to produce. So average total cost is always rising when the marginal cost curve is above that average total cost. So there's one point where the average total cost curve is going to be flat, and that's when the marginal cost curve, when the marginal cost of producing another unit is exactly the same as the average. Then it's not pushing that average up or down. And so the point where that average total cost curve is flat is exactly the point where the marginal cost curve is touching it. And so that the marginal cost curve is not dragging that average up or down. And that happens right at that minimum of the average total cost curve. So the idea of the marginal cost curve, when it's below the average total cost, what happens is it starts coming up and it intersects that average total cost curve right at its minimum where that curve is just flattening out. Okay. So, here's an example where that marginal cost curve is increasing. And you can see that, the average total cost starts out really high, but every time you produce an additional unit, that unit is pretty cheap to produce. It's kind of dragging the average down. So going from here to here, we're dragging the average down. But at some point, the marginal costs rise to the point where they just cross that average curve. And so they're not changing that average at all. And so that purple curve is just exactly flat where that marginal cost curve crosses it. And that's really kind of an amazing fact. And it's really just based on the idea that the curve is flat at its minimum. Okay. But here's average variable cost. Of course, it's below the average total cost because it doesn't have the fixed cost in it. Okay. Notice if we go out really far, the average total cost and the average variable cost pretty much the same because the fixed cost is just a very small fraction of the production costs if we're at a high level of production. Okay. Here's the average fixed cost. You can see it's just dying out, and it's just not important when you get into Q equals 9 and Q equals 10. Okay. So here's all the key points, and notice this point M, the really efficient production point, is where that marginal cost just hits the average total cost curve. Okay. So everything I've just said on this slide. This is just from the air and water show. I had a couple where you could actually see the pilots more clearly than that, but these don't quite show up at that level of resolution. Okay. So the minimum cost output is the quantity of output at which the average total cost is lowest. It's the bottom of that U-shaped average total cost curve. And that turns out to be a really important point. That's where price-taking firms are producing in a really competitive market with lots and lots of price takers. So average total cost equals marginal cost, like I keep saying. At output less than the minimum cost output, marginal cost is less than the average total cost, and the average total cost is falling. At outputs greater than the minimum cost output, the marginal cost is greater than the average total cost, and the average total cost is rising. That'll be important when we think about how industries react when there's a supply shock, because when there's a supply shock, let's say there's a demand shock, actually. Suppose that the demand suddenly goes up and firms start producing more to meet the extra demand. So now what they're doing is they're producing it, their marginal costs are pretty high in when they're trying to respond to that sudden shift in demand. And it turns out if new firms come in, that the best way to meet that demand is just have more firms that are still at that minimum cost output point. Okay. Here's just the classic, here's the relationship between average total cost and marginal cost. Pretty typical pretty typical curve. At over here, the average fixed cost is really playing an important role. Over here, it's not. Over here, it's driven by marginal cost. Yep. So in this part, we're dragging down the average as we produce more. And over here, we're dragging up the average. And here, the marginal cost exactly equals it. So producing another unit doesn't change the average total cost very much. Now, if you say, why does the marginal cost have this U shape? The initial downward slope often occurs because as you start hiring more workers, you can have them specializing in a more efficient way. But if you have so many workers that you've exhausted the benefits of specialization, then they start to get in each other's way. And you start to see diminishing returns to labor fitting in. So that U shape is kind of the intuitive way things tend to go. Great picture by Sonny. I'll have to find out what that is. Now, do marginal cost curves always slope upward? The word always kind of no, but most of the time that's pretty typical. Okay. Okay. So there's always diminishing returns if you just increase production enough. But this is at one point in time. I should say over time, these curves could change because technologies can improve things like that. Short run versus long run, all inputs are variable in the long run. So things like the size of a factory can change. And firms can actually pick their fixed cost in the long run based on the level of output that they expect to produce. Should I build $1 billion factory or a $100 million factory? Well, it depends on what I think the demand is going to be for my product. If I think demand is incredibly huge, I might want to build a huge factory that has really low marginal costs and really high fixed costs. But that may not be a reasonable thing to do if I'm worried that the demand for my product is just not going to reach that level. Okay? Because it's often a trade-off between higher fixed costs and lower variable costs. And so firms have to decide how big of an investment am I going to make when I'm maybe uncertain about what the demand is going to be for my product. Okay? So, oops. I must say, I hate that I can't move things around without advancing the PowerPoint. It's really annoying. So at low output levels, you want to have a low fixed cost. Now, here's just two different average total cost curves, one with a low fixed cost, one with a high fixed cost. If I think that demand is going to be pretty limited, the low fixed cost one starts to look pretty attractive. If I think the demand could be huge, then the high fixed cost ultimately is going to be cheaper for me. So predicting the demand is often important to understand how big of a fixed cost am I willing to do. And this, by the way, this also applies in the nonprofit sector. Should I build 5 healthcare clinics or should I build 3? If I build 5 clinics that are each very geographically optimal for lots of people around Chicago, then I don't have the transportation cost to move people around and that sort of thing. It's easier for my patients to get where they need to go. I don't have to give out cab vouchers, that kind of thing. You could imagine it's cheaper per patient if I have a huge demand for my services. If in fact demand is pretty low for the health services that I offer, maybe I want to have a smaller number of facilities around town, even though the transportation costs will be a little bit higher because I won't have to replicate a lot of other costs. That'll be hard to recover at the patient volume that I'm going to have, or the client volume I'm going to have. Okay. So there's always a little bit of optimization that's going on, that the firm is trying to pick the cheapest plant size for a given output level. So here's just a bad acid trip slide. Here's a couple of different, let me see if I can get all the things going here. firms can choose its own fixed costs to that might be optimal at a particular output scale that they think they're going to achieve. So, if I think I'm really going to have a huge demand, then a really big fixed cost makes a lot of sense. But that's a big gamble. I'm not going to, if I come out with a phone that's going to compete with Apple, I'm probably not going to start by building $1 billion factory. If I find that I'm really selling a lot of phones, then I can go do that. But initially, that would be, ridiculous thing to do. So increasing returns to scale, decreasing returns to scale matter. Whenever you have increasing returns to scale in an industry, by the way, that's where you tend to see really kind of a little bit screwy outcomes or monopoly. You have one huge firm just ends up being way more efficient than everybody else. And, it's kind of hard to compete with the Amazon distribution centers at this point, for example. They're just increasing returns to scale to having one huge warehouse with lots of delivery vehicles. They're going all over town. It's kind of hard to compete with that at that, with something that's not at that scale. You start hitting bottlenecks, decreasing returns to scale. We often assume in competitive markets a kind of constant return to scale, where like there's an efficient size of a farm, and then you can make lots and lots of farms, but each farm kind of looks the same. And there's an efficient farm size that we just kind of keep replicating. And that's usually what we assume in a competitive situation. That's a dragonfly. It's kind of cool. Slide isn't perfect, but it's kind of a cool picture. And now we get to chapter 12, perfect competition in the supply curve. You might want to take a moment to do some Tai Chi or something like that. What is perfect competition, and why do economists consider this to be a benchmark? What are the factors that make a firm or an industry perfectly competitive? How does a perfectly competitive industry determine the profit maximizing output level? And what determines if a firm is profitable or unprofitable? Why does it make sense for a firm to behave differently in the short run versus the long run? And how does the short run industry supply curve differ from the long run industry supply curve? These are some of the things we're going to talk about. My daughter's, by the way, going to come into the house as we are talking. She works at Express at the mall and gets to see the American public at its finest every day. So first of all, in perfect competition, we assume that all market participants, consumers and producers, are price takers. Many producers, each with a small market share, and everyone believes that their actions have no effect on the price. So each participant is kind of a drop in the bucket. Consumers regard all the products of all producers as kind of equivalent. Now, this is a little bit of oversimplification. So that is, there's a standardized product, and there's a very high cross-price demand elasticity. Now, I should say that you could imagine that you have a larger market like motor vehicles that has lots of standardized market segments. So, sport utility vehicles, subcompact cars, and so on. But at least within each segment, we've got a very standardized thing. And so that's important. So there's some of the conditions for perfect competition. Which of the following markets is most likely to be fully competitive, perfectly competitive? Cable TV, automobiles and trucks, oil refineries, farm commodities. So the idea here is there's lots of bottlenecks. So here at cable TV, of course, there's a potential monopoly because you have one company that sort of wires up the whole town. It's kind of hard for another company to come in and compete with that. There's tremendous economies of scale in just setting up the wiring network. Automobiles and trucks, there's sort of very large industries that maybe look more like an oligopoly, same with oil refineries. Lots of little farms, each of which is selling wheat, something like that. By the way, we haven't said anything here about the demand side. One of the interesting things about about some of the farm commodities is there is some evidence that some of the intermediary firms have real market power, that they don't quite look perfectly competitive. Like Tyson's chicken has a huge role to play in in the market price of chicken. And so there's a lot of subtlety in each of these areas. In the field of industrial organization, talks about some of the assumptions about imperfect competition. And we'll talk about some of that later. Now, most perfectly competitive industries are also characterized by free entry and exit. So it's easy for a new producer to enter the industry, and existing producers can easily leave the industry if, say, demand comes down a little bit. We don't need to sell so much salsa or whatever. Now, that's subtle. It's actually kind of a subtle point that free exit is important for a couple of different reasons. One is that, that keeps the market efficient when the demand contracts, but also when exit is very expensive, firms are not going to want to enter the market. And there's a weird way in which if you're sort of stuck in the market in some fundamental way, then it's easier for firms, the incumbent firms, the ones that are in there, to overcharge consumers, because no one really wants to come into the market to compete with them, because it's just hard to get out of that market if that turns out to be what you need to do. So entry barriers and exit barriers both matter as we think about market conditions. That's a little counterintuitive, but it's true. And another great picture by Sonny. Now, what do we mean by a standardized product? This is an example in the book about kimchi. So our Korean kimchi producers claim to be believed, is Japanese kimchi really different from and inferior to the Korean real thing? As far as economists are concerned, the products are different only if consumers believe them to be different. And marketing obviously plays a key role here. But I've never personally eaten kimchi in my life, so I do not know what this thing is. But this is apparently kimchi. So, I just have to take your word for it. Now let's think about revenue and profit. You've already seen this, but let's just kind of go over this again. Total revenue is just price times quantity. If I sell 1 million cars and each car costs $30,000, my total revenue is 30,000 times 1 million, or 30 billion. A bunch of you had some billion issues on the midterm. So, a billion is 1,000 million. And that's just what it is. Now, profit is total revenue minus total cost. So price times quantity minus total cost. Okay. By the way, we often, if you divide this total revenue minus total cost, so you divide that whole thing by Q, you're going to get total revenue divided by Q minus total cost over Q. Total cost over Q is just average total cost. What's total revenue divided by Q? It's just price. So price minus average total cost. That's actually my profit margin per unit. And if I take that and multiply by Q, I get the profit. So it's sort of, if you want to take this whole thing, but you might want to just check your understanding, multiply this whole thing times Q, and then divide each of these things by Q, and make sure you understand intuitively that it's the same as the overall quantity multiplied by price minus the average total cost. So price minus the average total cost is just my markup for each unit that I'm selling over what it costs me to produce that thing. Okay. It's the butterfly from Washington Park. Here's just Noel's farm. It's got what my profits are if the market price is $72. So Noel is a price taker. It's assuming whatever output level it picks, the market price is always 72. And so it's got a total revenue. This is just 72 times whatever this is, and it's got a total cost curve that corresponds to this quantity. And that just computes total revenue minus total cost. Okay. You might want to add, if you want to check your understanding, add another column here that's just average total cost, which is just this thing divided by the quantity. And take that thing, and here you take this and divide and subtract it from 72. You have the firm's markup at that level of production. So now let's just work on this a little bit and talk about marginal revenue. So remember remember the optimal output rule. So the profit maximizing principle of marginal analysis. The optimal amount of an activity is the level at which the marginal benefit equals the marginal cost. So the marginal revenue is kind of the equivalent of the marginal benefit there. It's the change in total revenue. How much more comes into your cash register if you produce one more unit? So it's a change in my total revenue per unit of additional stuff that I'm doing. Now, since the firm is a price taker, the change in my total revenue is just whatever the market price is of that last good, if I produce one more good. So, and the firm can sell as much as it wants at that price. So marginal revenue in a competitive market is just always the price that I can sell my product. Okay? So the firm is facing a perfectly elastic demand curve that's equivalent to its marginal revenue curve. Okay? So if we say marginal revenue equals marginal cost, then what is this going to tell me? I'm going to keep producing until my marginal cost equals what? I know the suspense is killing you here. Isn't that a great picture? That's just a time-lapse photography of a wave machine in the Museum of Science and Industry. Here's the idea. Price equals marginal cost. You keep producing until your marginal cost hits the market price of the good that you're selling. Okay. So marginal costs are rising. You pick the point where they just hit across the market price piece. So if you can get $30,000 for a car, you keep increasing your production level until your last car costs you $30,000 to produce, and then you stop. But here, suppose the market price for sneakers is $35. At my current low production level, let's say a sneaker costs me $26. So I keep increasing my production, and my marginal costs are rising. At some point, the marginal costs for sneakers are going to go from 26 to 35. That's where I stop. So I get zero profit out of the last sneaker I produced because I'm going to sell it for $35 and it cost me $35 to produce it. Okay. So in a price-taking firm increases its production to the point where that marginal cost curve just comes up and hits the market price of the good that's being produced. Okay. So in this particular case, what am I going to do? What's my optimal production level? Well, let's think about this. I produce 50 trees. I start out, let's say I start out, I'm producing 20 trees. And I say, well, what if I go up to 30 trees? Well, I'm going to get $72 for every tree that I sell. And it's only costing me about $32 a tree to make more trees. So I keep increasing that. But then I get up to 50 and I think, should I go from 50 to 60? No, because when I get to 60, or at least 60 is definitely too high. It may be that 55 is the right level, but clearly 60 is a little bit too high because it's costing me $80 to make a tree, and I'm only going to sell it for 72. So my profit is going to be somewhere. If I have to choose in groups of 10, it's going to be somewhere between these two. And if I have to pick one of these, it's probably this guy. Okay. So here's what I'm doing. There's a market price of trees, and I'm sort of picking production levels, and I'm following a marginal cost curve up until it hits that marginal revenue equals price point. Okay. If I'm to the left of E, I can produce more. If I'm sort of sitting here, I say, oh, I can produce more and I'll make money on some more stuff because I'm still cost me less to produce these points than I can sell this good at. But once I get to this point, should I increase my production more? No, the tree that I produced going from here to here, going from here to here, it's costing me more money to produce that last tree than I can actually sell that last tree for. So I kind of stop at this point. So I'm always looking for where that marginal cost curve comes up and hits that price. So, if I'm making cars, I keep raising my production level until I'm hitting a bottleneck and my cars start costing me more than $30,000 each to build if I can sell them for $30,000 each. Now, when things are kind of lumpy, then in general, you produce the largest quantity where the marginal revenue exceeds the marginal cost, and then you stop. When things are a little lumpy, sometimes you have to check with trial and error to see which thing works. Sometimes you're on one side or the other in a real problem, and you kind of have to check. But the basic idea is it's going to be somewhere right around that, very close to the point where the marginal cost curve crosses that market price curve. Okay. Now let's think about the different ways that firms could be profitable. By profitable, we mean economic profit. If I'm making more money producing this good than the opportunity cost of deploying my capital elsewhere. And so we often talk about zero economic profit. What that really means is the customary returns with everything else I could be doing with my money. Now, if total revenue is greater than total cost, the firm is profitable. Total revenue equals total cost. You're sort of exactly breaking even in terms of your economic profit. And if total revenue is less than total cost, then you're incurring a loss, and then we kind of have to think about what's going to happen. Okay. So if we think about it, if we divide both sides by Q in all these relationships, we can actually think about this in some ways a better way. So if price is greater than average total cost, the firm is profitable. Each time you make a car, average total cost of making a car is 25 grand. You're selling it for 30. You're making 5 grand for every car. If a firm produces a quantity where price and average total costs are equal, firms breaking even. They're just getting their economic profit to zero, which means they're equaling their opportunity cost of the money. So it's worth doing, but barely worth doing. If price is less than average total cost, then you're losing money. And if it costs you $32 to make cars that you can only sell for $30,000, you got a problem. And at least in the long run, probably something's got to change. Okay? This is, you can guess where this was taken from. I took this picture at the University of Chicago. I'll let you guess where that picture was taken from. Okay. So here's a short run production curve. Here's my optimal point. We've kind of already shown that. This is my profit maximizing point. But it'll turn out, although I'm not going to emphasize it here, that the producer surplus is actually the area between the marginal cost curve and this price. And kind of the idea is, I made this car. I made this tree. This tree cost me $6. I sold it for 18, so I made 12 on this one. This one cost me $8 and I sold it for 18. I made 10 on this one, and I sort of add up, and it turns out the area in here is what I get if I just add up all the producer surplus I'm getting from each of the ones that I'm selling here. Or the profit I'm getting from each of the ones that I'm selling here, because I actually have the fixed cost built in. So let's just see if we can get all the. So two different situations. Up top, the firm is profitable because the market price is higher than the minimum average total cost curve. So, the firm is, it's got a marginal cost curve here, and it's going to choose to produce at this point E, but the firm's making money because its average total cost curve is always below that market price. So this distance here is kind of its markup per unit sold, and it's selling. This is the number of units that it's selling. Oops, this is the number of units that it's selling. So this rectangle here is its profit. So when if the market price is above your average total cost curve, you're making money. And the amount of money you make is that rectangle. Down here, we got a problem that the market price is below the average total cost. So I'm losing money. Now, it might still be worth producing if the reason that I'm losing money is my fixed costs are sort of super high because I've already incurred those. If my variable cost is below that market price, it's worth me continuing to produce stuff, but I'm definitely losing money. I'm not recovering my fixed cost the way I need to. Yeah. It's just a cat that I saw in Chautauqua, New York, up on a ledge. Okay. So let's just see if we can fill in all these spots. Okay. So we've got a break-even price. The price has to be at least the minimum of the average total cost curve for you to be able to break even. That's what's marked here. So the market price is above the break-even price here. And it's got a profit, which is the difference between the price and the average total cost at this chosen production level, multiplied by the number of units that I'm selling. Okay. So here I'm selling 50 units and I've got a markup of $14.40. So I've got a total profit of $720. Okay. So at that point Z, the average total cost is $57.60, something like that. And I'm able to sell for $72. So that difference, which is $14.40, is what allows me to make a profit. Down here, I'm kind of screwed because I'm losing money because I'm below my average total cost curve. Okay. So the break-even price of a price-taking firm is the market price at which it would earn zero profit. In the long run, you've got to at least get your break-even price out of things. Okay. Here's a question. If a firm is earning positive economic profit, it must be the case that what? The price has got to be greater than the average cost, right? This is the only situation where there's a positive economic profit. That's what these guys are about to tell us. Yep. See, they knew it. They're flocking towards that last example. I know because there's 4 of them and it's option D. Okay. Now down below, there's a loss. And that loss is the loss per unit is the difference between the average total cost and the price. In this case, the average total cost is higher, so it's a loss multiplied by the number of units that they're selling, which is 30. So in this particular case down below, they'd be losing $560. See why my daughter is texting me at this hour. My daughter's following the voting tonight. Okay. Now, some things to know. One is that losses don't mean immediate shutdown. If I'm losing money because I've got these big fixed costs that I'm not recovering, in the short run, I still might want to be producing. If I'm getting back at least my average variable cost, I want to keep producing. It's like if I'm an airline, here's a practical example. I'm an airline and I bought all my planes. I own them. I paid all those fixed costs, and it cost me $700 per passenger to operate those planes in terms of my average total cost. But let's suppose the average variable cost is only $150. Most of the cost is, say, the cost of the plane, and the tickets, and I can sell my tickets for $300. I'm sort of screwed in the long run, but in the short run, everyone, including my creditors, benefits if I keep operating those planes and getting $300 per passenger, because at least I'm getting something that's contributing towards paying my fixed costs. And what the bankruptcy court might say is, hey, let's renegotiate that debt or find a way that you can keep functioning so that we don't lose the entire economic value of this firm, because even though they're not able to recover their full fixed costs. Now, if tickets cost $300, or if my average variable cost is $300 and the market price for tickets is $200, then I'm actually going to have to shut down. I can't even recover my variable costs by doing a flight from Chicago to LaGuardia. If that particular flight, even ignoring the cost of the plane, the cost of the fuel and having the crew on the plane exceeds what I can sell my tickets for, then I don't want to do it. Then I just have to shut down. And so the minimum of the average variable cost turns out to be the shutdown price. And when price is greater than the minimum average variable cost, at least in the short run, you want to keep going. But there are times when that fails to hold, and then you kind of have to shut down. If you're losing money, even just running this flight, even aside from all my fixed costs, it's just I cannot recover the cost of just the immediate cost of doing this flight. Then I kind of cease operations. Okay. So here, Gnomes R Us, a competitive firm, produces where the marginal cost curve intersects with the average total cost curve as minimum. So what's going to happen? Interesting example. So the price is, let's just see. The marginal cost curve intersects with the average total cost curve. So what you're doing is you're producing at a level where, in a perfectly competitive situation, the market price has been set so that there's zero economic profits. Now, you might say, why is that? How do I know it's zero economic profits? Suppose that there were positive economic profits and there are firms that can come in and out. What would happen is lots of new firms would come in, and they would try to get some of that profit, and that would bid the price down. So the key thing is when he says a competitive firm, what he means is really a firm in a fully competitive market with price takers. That's where you get zero economic profits. And we know that it's that way because the if we say the market price is kind of given, that's kind of saying it's a very competitive situation. Okay. This is worth looking at in the book, this section. Should a competitive firm keep producing even if it faces short-term losses and is producing at a point on its marginal cost curve that is above the minimum average variable cost curve? What do you think? Yep. Because it's covering its variable costs and at least some of the fixed costs. So as long as you're above the average variable cost curve, at least in the short term, you want to keep going. Even if you can't really recover all your fixed costs, you want to keep going. Okay. So a firm will produce at every price above the minimum average total cost, where price intersects the marginal cost curve. But it will stop producing in the short run if the market price falls below the shutdown price. Okay? So if it falls below the minimum of the average variable cost curve, then they just stop. And each of the firms is kind of doing this, and that's where the industry supply curve comes from, right? Because each of the firms is kind of saying, I'm going to find that point on the marginal cost curve that sort of maximizes my profit given whatever the market price is. Each of the firms is doing that, and the end result is we get an industry supply curve that's the total supply provided by each of these firms, and because they're earning zero profit, it'll basically end up being a flat curve at exactly this price point. The industry supply curve will just be a big flat curve that goes right through there. And there'll be lots and lots of firms, each one of which is producing right at that point. Okay. And that's sort of an interesting thing. But I would note that each firm has its own supply curve. This is sort of a cool factor. Each individual firm has its own supply curve. How much am I willing to supply if the market price is given? And it turns out if the market price is, say, $18, I keep producing until this point E, right where my last unit is going to cost me $18. I don't want to produce my next unit because that cost me $19 to make, and I'm only going to make 18. So I stop at this point E, and if the price falls, say, to 16, well, then I'm going to end up at some point that's in between C and E that intersects that $16. Let's see, I might be over here. If I look at all the different prices, it turns out the firm's supply curve is just the piece of, in the short run, it's the piece of that marginal cost curve that's above average variable cost. The short-term supply curve is just this line segment right here. It's every point where I can at least get my average variable cost curve back, my average variable cost back, and then I just keep producing to the point where my production level, my marginal cost hits the market price. So if the market price is 12, I'm producing at B. If it's 14, I'm at C. And if it's 18, I'm at E. Now, the firm's long-term supply curve, I've got to at least get my fixed cost back. So the long-term supply curve is only the piece of this marginal cost curve that's above the average total cost curve. So in the long run, my supply curve is between C and this point. In the short run, it's everything from A on up along this marginal cost curve. Because in the short run, all I have to get back is my average variable cost. But in the long run, I've got to get my fixed cost back too. So this marginal cost curve that the firm has is its own individual supply curve when it thinks about how much it wants to produce. Okay. Now, what happens if firms change their fixed costs? So firms do have a choice about how much fixed costs they want to incur, and they're sort of predicting how much, what's the scale of my sales, and I'm kind of have to decide how much of a fixed cost I'm willing to incur that would sort of make sense for how much what I think my total volume of sales is going to be. If I think I'm going to have a huge volume of sales, a really big fixed cost that makes my factory more efficient might be well worth it. If I think that my sales are going to be pretty limited, then sort of low fixed cost strategy may make more sense for me, because that average fixed cost, I just won't sell enough units to really offset that. So a small company just is not going to capitalize as intensively as a big company will. So just in summing up, if price is bigger than the minimum average total cost, firms profitable, but new firms are going to want to come into that industry in the long run because they can see that somebody's making money. Price is just equal to the minimum of the average total cost curve. This is kind of, the firms are breaking even. There's no incentives for firms to come in or to leave the industry. This is kind of where a perfectly competitive industry ends up. Price is less than the minimum of the average total cost curves. Then you got a problem that basically firms are going to leave that industry in the long run. And then if we think about the short run, everything's kind of exactly the same, except it's around the average variable cost instead of the average total cost. So if price is bigger than the minimum of the average variable cost, firms are going to keep going, whether or not they recover their fixed cost. The price just matches the minimum of the average variable cost curve. Firms are kind of indifferent between producing or not. And if price is less than the average variable cost, then firms they're just going to shut down immediately. Just, it doesn't pay to even run the next flight. Okay. That's a dragonfly that I took a picture of in the south suburbs. A little scary. So now let's think about industry supply curves. The industry supply curve shows the relationship between the price of a good, the market price, and the total output of the industry in response to that market price. Okay, so in the short run, how does the quantity supply depend on the market price if you have a fixed number of producers that are already in the market? That's kind of the key point. You got a fixed number of producers that are already present. And how are they going to respond when market prices change? Okay, and there's a short run market equilibrium where the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded, given that the number of producers is kind of fixed. Okay, so right now, there's 6 bagel shops in Hyde Park, and they're going to pick a supply curve that is influenced by the demand for their product. And there's some sort of an equilibrium price and quantity, given that we got 6 bagel shops. Okay. So here's a short-run industry supply curve. There's a demand curve. This is for trees. There's a shutdown price. There's a market price, etc. This is just a picture I took, another scary picture I took. I'd forgotten who the artist is for this, but it's pretty awesome, scary picture. Now, the long run market equilibrium allows for the idea that firms are going to come in or exit the industry depending on what, if each firm is making a profit, some other firm's going to look and say, oh, I can get in on that. There's 6 bagel stores in Hyde Park. Each one of them is making $1 million a year. Somebody says, hey, I'm going to open the 7th bagel store. At least it may take some time for that to happen, but that's what's going to happen. Okay. So you can see here, the more firms are coming in the market, they're shifting out the supply, and what is that doing? Is driving down the price. And each individual firm is going to actually cut back on how much it's producing because there's more firms coming into the market, and also the market price has declined. So what happens is over time, maybe before initially when there was a small number of firms, I'm producing here at 70, market price is $72. I'm way over my average total cost. As more and more firms come in, market price drops. I'm going to pick the lower point of my marginal cost curve. I'm going to pick this point when the price is $64. And this process kind of keeps continuing until we end up at a really competitive equilibrium that ends up being right here at this efficient production point. So when there's entry into the market, we're basically going to drive the price down to where each of the firms ends up at this point. So lots and lots of firms, each one of them is at the minimum of their average total cost curve. From the point of view of the society, it's actually a very efficient outcome because this is the most efficient way that we can produce trees. Lots of different firms, each one of which is at its most efficient size. And firms are earning zero economic profit. And there's a lot of consumer surplus that's coming because it's pretty cheap to buy a tree now. And so you can play this out in the book, but you can see how in the long run, when there's free entry and exit, it kind of pushes towards that point where firms are just right at that break-even price point. And there's here's an example where if you look in the book at this figure 12.7, it sort of plays it out the way it's going to work. And we're always ending, if we really let the thing go, we kind of end up at this point where there's lots of firms, each one of which is at that point. A couple of things about that. One is the long run supply curve is flatter than the short run supply curve. So in the long run, this industry supply curve is quite price elastic. In the short run, you could have all kinds of bottlenecks, things like that. But in the long run, industry supply curves tend to be pretty flat. They don't have to be totally flat, but they're a lot flatter than the short term. Now, why is it that they might not be totally flat? It could look like that sometimes. Well, suppose there's some fundamental bottleneck. Like we're talking about wheat prices in the United States. Well, there's only so much land in the United States that's really awesome for making wheat. So you can imagine we start to deplete the really good land. There's some positive slope on that supply curve there. So it doesn't have to be completely flat, but in the long run, it's a lot flatter than the short run supply curve is. Okay. Some couple I saw on a motorcycle in central Illinois. I've forgotten who these people were. I don't think I actually knew them. Okay. The long run industry supply curve. Now, it can be perfectly elastic if costs are constant across the industry. So, if there's plenty of inputs available and the production technologies are widely known, very often the industry supply curve is pretty perfectly elastic. But if there's some sort of an input that's in limited supply, then the industry supply curve tends to have a little bit of an upward slope. And, like beachfront resort hotels, they can compete very openly. There's only so much beach property. So, there's a bottleneck that's ultimately going to start, it's going to give that supply curve a positive slope. And so those are industries that have increasing costs. It's even possible in some ways to have the slopes go down. Although I must say that in general, most of the time we say the extreme case is kind of flat. But if there's sort of super increasing returns to scale, you'll occasionally see that. Excuse me. Now, why would a firm want to enter an industry if the market price is only slightly greater than the break-even price? Because really the economic profit is a measure of the opportunity cost. So if there's any kind of positive profit at all, even if it's very small, it's basically saying that's a better use of funds than is available elsewhere in the economy. But you guess what that is and where it was taken. What happens in the long run if you have a perfectly competitive industry with identical firms? So you get each one's earning zero economic profit. Each one's producing the quantity that leads to their break-even price. And they're producing the profit maximizing quantity, which marginal revenue equals marginal costs. Okay. And this marginal revenue is the market price. So these are sort of the three main things that are happening in the long run when you have a perfect competitive market with identical firms. Okay. The end. That's just a violinist in Paris. Thank you for bearing with me. And I'm going to stop now. I'm going to see who won the various things.